January 27, 1945, Karen Hall, 50 miles north of Berlin. Hermann Göring stands at the window of his vast hunting lodge, staring at the winter sky. It's empty, no contrails, no formations, just grey clouds and the distant rumble of something that sounds like thunder, but isn't. It's Allied bombers, hundreds of them, passing overhead unchallenged, on their way to pulverize Berlin. The Reichsmarschall, commander of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated successor, the man who once promised Germany would never be bombed, doesn't move, he just watches. His aides stand behind him, silent, waiting for orders that don't come. Outside, the forests of Brandenburg are silent, except for the drone of enemy engines. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, has ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The few fighters that can still fly are grounded for lack of fuel. The pilots who remain are too green to survive their first combat sortie, and the bombers, those magnificent machines that terrorized Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London, sit rusting on airfields that no longer have crews to fly them. Göring knows this. He's known it for months, perhaps years. But this morning, standing at the window whilst enemy aircraft darken the sky unchallenged, the knowledge becomes undeniable. The Luftwaffe is finished, and with it, any illusion that Germany can still win this war. Before we continue, if you enjoy cinematic deep dives into history like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps us bring forgotten stories to life. To understand the moment Hermann Göring realized his air force was destroyed, you have to rewind 7 years to 1938, when the Luftwaffe seemed invincible and Göring himself appeared to be one of history's great military commanders. September 1938, the Munich crisis. Hitler demands the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, threatening war if refused. Britain and France, desperate to avoid conflict, agree to his terms. Chamberlain returns to London speaking of peace for our time. Behind that surrender lies a calculation about German air power, specifically the belief that the Luftwaffe could obliterate London and Paris before the British or French could respond. That belief was Göring's greatest achievement. He'd built an air force from nothing. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany military aviation, and by 1938, he commanded over 3,000 aircraft, organized into squadrons that could strike anywhere in Europe. More importantly, he'd convinced the world that German air superiority was absolute, that challenging the Luftwaffe meant inviting annihilation. It worked. Not because the Luftwaffe was actually invincible. Intelligence assessments overestimated its strength, and British air defenses were stronger than Germany realized. But because perception mattered more than reality, the threat of German bombers influenced diplomatic decisions, shaped military strategy, and gave Hitler the confidence to push boundaries he otherwise wouldn't have dared approach. Göring reveled in it. He cultivated an image of power, excess, and eccentric brilliance. Uniforms covered in medals, vast estates filled with looted art, grandiose titles and pronouncements. He wasn't just commander of the Luftwaffe. He was Reichsmarschall, Minister of Aviation, plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, master of the German hunt, and a dozen other titles that emphasized his proximity to Hitler and his dominance over German military and economic life. But beneath the bombast lay genuine accomplishment. Göring had overseen the Luftwaffe's creation, its training doctrine, its integration with ground forces. He understood that air power wasn't about dogfights and aces. It was about supporting armies, disrupting enemy logistics, and breaking civilian morale. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, depended fundamentally on tactical air support, and Göring delivered it. Poland, September 1939, the Luftwaffe's first test. German bombers and dive bombers tear through Polish defenses in coordinated strikes that shatter communications, destroy airfields, and terrorize civilians. Warsaw burns. Polish resistance collapses within weeks. The Luftwaffe suffers losses, nearly 400 aircraft destroyed, but Ahat achieves every objective. The world watches and concludes that German air power is as devastating as Göring promised. France, May 1940, the Luftwaffe's greatest triumph. As German panzers drive through the Ardennes, Luftwaffe Stukas provide close air support, obliterating French defensive positions. German fighters dominate the skies, shooting down Allied aircraft at ratios that border on massacre. Within 6 weeks, France surrenders. The Luftwaffe has proven itself essential to victory, and Göring's prestige reaches its zenith. Hitler promotes him to Reichsmarschall, a rank created specifically for Göring, placing him above every other military officer in Germany. But France also reveals the first cracks in Luftwaffe invincibility. German losses exceed 1,400 aircraft. Pilot fatigue becomes severe. Maintenance crews struggle to keep pace with operational demands. And most critically, the Luftwaffe demonstrates a fundamental limitation. It's designed for short, intense campaigns supporting ground forces. Extended operations over hostile territory strain resources, logistics, and morale. These cracks will widen into chasms over Britain. July 1940, the Battle of Britain begins. Hitler, having conquered France, now faces an enemy he can't reach. Britain, protected by the Channel, defended by the Royal Air Force, and stubbornly refusing to negotiate peace. The Wehrmacht has no amphibious assault capability. An invasion requires air superiority, which means the Luftwaffe must destroy the RAF. Göring accepts the challenge with characteristic confidence. He's convinced the RAF is already weakened, that British industrial capacity can't replace losses, that a few weeks of concentrated bombing will force Britain to capitulate. He tells Hitler the Luftwaffe will sweep the skies clean within days. It doesn't. The Battle of Britain lasts 4 months, and it exposes every flaw in Luftwaffe doctrine, equipment, and leadership. German bombers, designed for tactical support, lack the range and payload for strategic bombing. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's premier fighter, has fuel for only 30 minutes over Britain before needing to return. German intelligence consistently underestimates RAF strength, reporting squadrons destroyed that reappear the next day. But the deepest problem is Göring himself. He interferes constantly, issuing contradictory orders, changing strategy every few days. First, the Luftwaffe targets RAF airfields, then coastal shipping, then London, then back to airfields. Pilots and commanders struggle to execute coherent plans when objectives shift daily. Göring blames them for failures, accusing his fighter pilots of cowardice when they report heavy losses. By September 1940, the Luftwaffe is losing the war of attrition. German aircraft production can't match losses. Experienced pilots are dying faster than replacements can be trained, and British morale, rather than breaking, hardens with every raid. Hitler postpones the invasion indefinitely. Operation Celion, the planned conquest of Britain, becomes a fantasy shelved for later. The Luftwaffe has failed its first strategic test. Göring retreats to Carenhall and begins collecting morphine prescriptions. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe returns to what it does best, supporting ground offensives. In the opening hours of Barbarossa, German aircraft destroy over 1,200 Soviet planes, most on the ground. For weeks, the Luftwaffe dominates Soviet skies, providing the close air support that enables panzers to drive hundreds of miles into Russia. Göring's confidence returns. This is what the Luftwaffe was built for. Decisive campaigns, enemy collapse, rapid victory. Britain was an aberration. Now, on the vast Eastern Front, German air power will prove unstoppable. Except the Soviet Union doesn't collapse. The Luftwaffe faces challenges it's never encountered. Soviet territory is immense, distances that would span France multiple times over. Airfields are primitive, often just grass strips that turn to mud. Supply lines stretch to breaking, and the Soviets, despite catastrophic losses, keep producing aircraft. Factories beyond the Urals churn out Yaks, Lavochkins, Ilyushins at rates German intelligence insists are impossible. By winter 1941, the Luftwaffe is exhausted. Pilots fly multiple sorties daily without rest. Maintenance crews work through nights to keep aircraft operational. Losses accumulate, not from epic dogfights, but from mechanical failures, accidents, and the grinding attrition of constant operations in hostile conditions. And then the Soviet Air Force starts to improve. New aircraft, better tactics, pilots gaining experience. By 1942, German air superiority is no longer guaranteed. By 1943, it's contested. By 1944, it's lost. Göring watches this erosion from Berlin, issuing orders that become increasingly detached from reality. He demands production increases that industry can't deliver. He blames generals for defeats that stem from impossible strategic situations. He promises Hitler that the Luftwaffe will reverse setbacks, that new wonder weapons will restore dominance. None of it happens. If you're still watching, you're clearly a history lover. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next story. The real collapse begins in 1943, and it starts with a single catastrophic miscalculation. Stalingrad, winter 1942-43. The German Sixth Army, 290,000 men, is encircled by Soviet forces. They need supplies, food, ammunition, fuel. Hitler forbids retreat and orders the Luftwaffe to supply the trapped army by air. Göring promises it can be done. He tells Hitler that the Luftwaffe can deliver 300 tons of supplies daily, the minimum needed to keep the Sixth Army fighting. He's basing this on nothing except wishful thinking and desperation to maintain favor with Hitler. The reality is brutal. The Luftwaffe manages, on its best days, perhaps 100 tons, usually far less. Aircraft are shot down, crash in blizzards, or can't reach Stalingrad due to weather. Pilots fly in impossible conditions, many dying in the attempt, and it's nowhere near enough. The Sixth Army starves, freezes, disintegrates. On February 2nd, 1943, the survivors surrender. Over 90,000 men march into Soviet captivity. Most will never return. Göring's promise, his guarantee that the Luftwaffe could save Stalingrad, has been exposed as a lie, not a well-intentioned miscalculation, a lie. He'd assured Hitler based on numbers he knew were impossible, because admitting the Luftwaffe couldn't do it would have meant admitting weakness. Hitler doesn't forget. From this point forward, Göring's influence wanes. Hitler stops consulting him on military matters. Other commanders bypass him, dealing directly with the Führer. Göring retreats further into Carenhall, surrounding himself with art, luxury, and morphine, whilst the war he helped start grinds Germany into dust. But worse is coming, because whilst the Luftwaffe bleeds in the east, a new threat builds in the west. May 1943, the Allied combined bomber offensive begins in earnest. American B-17s and B-24s by day, British Lancasters and Halifaxes by night. Thousands of bombers escorted by long-range fighters systematically destroying German cities and industrial capacity. The Luftwaffe throws everything it has at them: fighters, flak, tactics refined through desperate experience. It's not enough. The mathematics are inexorable. The Allies can replace losses. Germany can't. Every month, Allied production increases whilst German output declines. American factories alone are producing more aircraft than the entire Axis combined, and the quality gap is closing. American P-51 Mustangs and British Spitfires match or exceed German fighters in performance. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe is fighting a defensive war it can't win. German fighters shoot down dozens of bombers per raid, but hundreds still get through. Cities burn, factories crumble. Civilian casualties mount into the hundreds of thousands. Göring issues increasingly frantic directives. He demands that fighter production be quadrupled. He orders new tactics, Sturmgruppen formations designed to ram through bomber formations regardless of losses. He promises wonder weapons. The Me-262 jet fighter will sweep Allied aircraft from the sky. Just wait a few more months. But months turn into years, and the Me-262 arrives too late, in too few numbers, flown by pilots with inadequate training and no fuel. It's a technological marvel, rendered irrelevant by industrial collapse. The bomber offensive peaks in early 1944. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Every major German city experiences apocalyptic raids. The Luftwaffe's fighter force, once numbered in thousands, dwindles to hundreds. Experienced pilots die in unequal battles. Replacements last days, sometimes hours, and Göring, the man who once promised Germany would never be bombed, can do nothing except watch his cities burn from the comfort of Carinhal, where his stolen art collection remains immaculate whilst the Reich crumbles around him. June 6th, 1944. D-Day, Allied forces land in Normandy supported by overwhelming air power. Over 11,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports dominate the skies. The Luftwaffe manages barely 300 sorties. On D-Day, German pilots report conditions that sound like madness. For every German aircraft, there are 30 Allied ones. Attacking means certain death. Not attacking means court-martial. They attack anyway. Most don't return. Göring's response to D-Day is to blame his pilots. He accuses them of cowardice, suggests they lack fighting spirit, implies that if they were true National Socialists, they'd achieve the impossible through sheer will. This from a man who hasn't visited a frontline unit in years, who spends his days in luxury whilst his airmen die in one-sided battles. The pilots stop believing in him entirely, not in public. That would be suicide. But privately, in letters and diaries, they write with bitterness about the Reichsmarschall, who demands miracles whilst offering nothing except insults. One fighter pilot, a veteran of 4 years combat, writes to his wife, "Göring says we lack courage. I've seen courage. I've watched it burn in cockpits and scatter across French fields. What we lack is aircraft, fuel, and leadership that understands reality. Courage can't fight radar. Will doesn't shoot down Mustangs. And dying bravely for nothing isn't heroism, it's waste." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe has ceased to be a strategic factor. It can still inflict local damage, still mount desperate raids, but it can't protect German cities, can't support the Wehrmacht, can't challenge Allied air supremacy. The skies belong to the enemy, and Göring knows it. And if you're enjoying this deep dive, A quick reminder, subscribing helps us keep making stories like this every week. The question isn't when Göring realized the Luftwaffe was finished. The question is when he admitted it to himself, to Hitler, to history. Because realization came gradually in accumulating moments that each suggested defeat, but together spelled annihilation. The failure over Britain, the exhaustion in Russia, the collapse at Stalingrad, the bomber streams over Berlin, D-Day, each a wound, together death by 1,000 cuts. But admission is different. Admission requires confronting not just present failure, but past responsibility. It means acknowledging that the Luftwaffe's destruction wasn't just bad luck or enemy superiority. It was the consequence of decisions, priorities, and leadership failures that trace directly back to him. Göring built the Luftwaffe for a specific kind of war, short, decisive campaigns supporting ground forces in occupied territory. It was brilliant for Poland and France, adequate for the early Eastern Front, catastrophic for everything after. He didn't plan for strategic bombing, for defending German airspace, for wars of attrition against industrial superpowers. He didn't invest in heavy bombers capable of reaching Britain's factories or the Soviet interior. He didn't prioritize pilot training programs that could replace losses. He didn't develop doctrine for air defense in depth. These weren't oversights. They were conscious choices reflecting his understanding of air power and his political position within the Nazi hierarchy. Göring wanted the Luftwaffe to be indispensable to Hitler, which meant it had to deliver rapid, visible victories, strategic bombing campaigns that took years, defensive strategies that meant watching cities burn whilst conserving forces. Those didn't serve political objectives, so they weren't prioritized. Now, in 1945, those choices have killed the Luftwaffe as surely as any Allied bomb. And Göring, trapped between the reality he can't change and the image he can't abandon, retreats into delusion and excess. He issues orders for offensives that can't happen. He plans counterattacks with aircraft that don't exist. He promises Hitler that new jets, new tactics, new wonder weapons will restore air superiority. Just give it time. Hitler stops listening. January 1945, the final humiliation. The Soviets launched their winter offensive, driving deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe attempts one last desperate operation, Unternehmen Bodenplatte, Operation Baseplate. Every available fighter, nearly 1,000 aircraft, will strike Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, destroying aircraft on the ground, buying time for the Reich. It's the Luftwaffe's final gamble, throwing its last reserves at one decisive blow. The operation launches January 1st. German fighters achieve complete surprise, strafing Allied airfields and destroying over 300 aircraft. For a few hours, it seems like the old days. German pilots achieving impossible victories through skill and daring. Then the costs become clear. The Luftwaffe loses over 300 aircraft and 230 pilots. Many are shot down by German flak because communication broke down, and their own anti-aircraft gunners didn't know friendly aircraft were operating in the area. The pilots lost include irreplaceable veterans, squadron leaders, instructors, men who can't be replaced, and the Allies replace their losses within days. Within weeks, it's as if Bodenplatte never happened. German airfields, meanwhile, are empty. The reserves are gone. There will be no more mass operations. Göring learns of the losses in his study at Carinhal. He doesn't rage, doesn't issue new directives. He just nods, dismisses his aides, and pours another drink. The Luftwaffe is finished. And this time, even Hermann Göring can't pretend otherwise. February 1945, Hitler strips Göring of command authority over the Luftwaffe. assigning tactical control to regional commanders. Göring retains his titles, his uniforms, his place in the succession, but he's been neutered. His orders are ignored. His presence at military conferences is tolerated out of habit, not respect. Göring doesn't fight it. He retreats to Karenhal and begins packing. The Red Army is approaching, and his vast estate, filled with looted masterpieces from across conquered Europe, will soon be overrun. He orders the most valuable pieces shipped south to Bavaria. The rest he destroys. Better that than let the Soviets have them. April 20th, 1945, Hitler's last birthday. Göring attends the final conference in the Führerbunker beneath Berlin. The atmosphere is surreal. Soviet artillery can be heard in the distance. The Reich is collapsing hour by hour, and Hitler's staff are discussing horoscopes and miracle weapons. Göring suggests evacuating to Bavaria, regrouping, continuing resistance from the Alps. Hitler seems to agree. Göring leaves Berlin believing he might soon be called upon to lead what remains of the Reich. He's wrong. 3 days later, Göring sends a telegram to Hitler, carefully worded, deferential, but essentially asking, if you're incapacitated in Berlin, should I assume leadership as your designated successor? Hitler interprets this as treason. He strips Göring of all rank and titles, orders his arrest, expels him from the Nazi party. The Reichsmarshal, who once stood second only to Hitler, is suddenly a nobody, detained by SS guards in Bavaria, waiting to see if he'll be executed or simply forgotten. Hitler dies April 30th. Göring survives to surrender to American forces on May 8th. He expects to be treated as a senior military commander, accorded the respect due his rank. Instead, he's arrested as a war criminal, stripped of his decorations and imprisoned pending trial. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The Nuremberg trials begin in November 1945. Göring is the most senior Nazi in the dock. Himmler is dead by suicide. Hitler is dead. Goebbels is dead. That makes Göring the face of the Reich, forced to answer for everything. The war, the atrocities, the millions dead. He defends himself with unexpected vigor. The morphine has been taken away. His mind is clearer than it's been in years. He parries prosecutors' questions, deflects blame, presents himself as a loyal soldier following orders. He's articulate, intelligent, sometimes disturbingly charming. But when asked about the Luftwaffe, about his promises, his failures, his role in the Reich's collapse, the mask slips. He becomes defensive, evasive, bitter. He blames Hitler for interfering, blames the generals for cowardice, blames German industry for inadequate production, blames everyone except himself. The prosecutors present evidence, production figures showing the Luftwaffe had adequate resources until Göring's mismanagement wasted them. Testimony from pilots describing his detachment and incompetence. Records of his looting, his excess, his moral bankruptcy, whilst the Reich he served committed atrocities beyond imagining. Göring is convicted on all counts, sentenced to death by hanging. He cheats the hangman. The night before his execution, he swallows a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell. His body is found October 16th, 1946. He's wearing his Luftwaffe uniform, stripped of insignia, one final act of defiance against the verdict. What destroyed the Luftwaffe? The easy answer points to material factors: Allied industrial capacity, American production, Soviet resilience, technological advances, strategic bombing. All true, all important, but they don't explain how an air force that dominated European skies in 1940 became irrelevant by 1944. Material advantages don't account for the collapse. Plenty of forces have overcome material disadvantages through superior strategy, leadership, innovation. The Luftwaffe's destruction was ultimately a failure of leadership, vision, and adaptation. Göring built an air force for the war he wanted to fight, not the war he got. He designed for tactical support and short campaigns, then faced strategic bombing and prolonged attrition. He prioritized political loyalty over military competence, surrounding himself with yes-men who reinforced his delusions rather than confronting reality. When circumstances demanded adaptation, developing long-range escorts, prioritizing fighter production, investing in air defense networks, he clung to outdated doctrine and wonder weapon fantasies. When his pilots needed leadership, he offered insults and impossible demands. When Germany needed honest assessment of capabilities, he provided fantasy and blame. This is the tragedy of Hermann Göring. He was competent enough to build something magnificent, but not wise enough to understand its limitations or adapt when circumstances changed. His ego, his addiction, his need to maintain favor with Hitler, all of it prevented the kind of honest reckoning that might have salvaged something from the wreckage. And because he couldn't adapt, couldn't admit failure, couldn't lead effectively, thousands of young men died in aircraft they had no chance of bringing home. Cities burned. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of German power, became a symbol of Nazi hubris, incompetence, and collapse. January 27th, 1945, Karin Hall, dawn. Hermann Göring stands at the window watching Allied bombers pass overhead unchallenged. Behind him, aides wait for orders. Around him, crates of stolen art wait to be shipped south, away from the advancing Soviets. The sky is grey, empty of German aircraft, full of enemies. Göring knows finally and completely that it's over. The Luftwaffe is finished. The Reich is dying. And he, Reichsmarschall, Hitler's chosen successor, the man who promised Germany invincibility, has failed utterly and irreversibly. He doesn't speak, doesn't issue orders, just stands at the window watching the bombers drone past, listening to distant thunder that isn't thunder at all. In a few weeks, he'll flee south. In a few months, he'll surrender. In a year, he'll be convicted and sentenced to death. And decades later, when historians analyze the Luftwaffe's collapse, they'll point to this moment, not because anything happened, but because this was when Göring stopped pretending. The Luftwaffe wasn't destroyed by a single battle or strategic error. It died by degrees, eroded by decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved catastrophic in aggregate. It died from institutional arrogance, from leaders who valued image over substance, from a system that rewarded loyalty over competence. And it died because Hermann Göring, when confronted with reality, chose morphine, art collecting, and delusion over the hard work of leadership, adaptation, and honest reckoning with failure. The bombers pass, the sky empties, and Hermann Göring turns away from the window, walking back into a mansion filled with stolen beauty, leaving behind the wreckage of the air force he built, commanded, and destroyed through equal parts ambition, incompetence, and unwillingness to see what everyone else could already see. The Luftwaffe was finished, and perhaps it always had been, from the moment it was entrusted to a man more concerned with appearing invincible than being effective, more interested in Hitler's favor than his pilots' lives, more committed to the fantasy of German supremacy than the reality of what air power required in a modern, industrial, total war. The sky belongs to the enemy now, and it will for the rest of history. If this story moved you or made you think differently about history, please share it. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered, not because they're heroic, but because they're human, and we'll see you in the next one.